All right, welcome everyone to our genetics pop-up. If you are looking for the Mountain States Regional Genetics Network pop-up, you are in the right place. We're just letting some people in from the waiting room, so we'll give them just a moment to join. Thank you all for being here. Happy Friday. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. We have a lot to cover today, and we want to make sure there's lots of time for your questions and answers and to be able to connect you to our genetic navigators so you can ask them your questions. So welcome, my name is Christy Weiss. I'm the projects manager for Mountain States Regional Genetics Network, and we are so glad to have you at our 2022 Genetics Pop-Up, Ask a Genetic Navigator. Next slide, please. I know we've all been on Zoom for a very long time, but some people may still be new to it. So we just have a little bit of logistics here. At number one, you can find your mute and unmute button. We're asking everybody to stay on mute until the question and answer period. The number two is your video on-off switch. Feel free to turn your camera on. I see some of your faces. It's great to see some folks, so thank you. But feel free to keep it off if you feel more comfortable. We are recording up until the question and answer portion. So we will turn the recording off when people start asking questions. Number three is the active participation list. And number four is the chat feature. Feel free to email or chat myself, Jay, or Cody for technical issues. We'll keep an eye on that. And we will also use this feature for question and answer if you prefer not to ask your question live. Next slide. Oh, I think we skipped to the very end. So we do have Spanish interpretation available for today's pop-up. We have some logistics for you in finding the interpretation. At the bottom, there's an interpretation button, and you can choose your channel. You can choose English, Spanish, or you can also choose Spanish and mute original audio. So just wanted to orient individuals of where those were. Hopefully, if you are looking for the Spanish channel, you have found it, and that is working well on your end. Next slide. When we do get to the question and answer period, we will be asking individuals to raise their hand and wait to be called on, and then ask you to state your name when you begin talking. That will help for our interpretation and also help for us to be able to make sure everybody's questions get answered. Again, if you prefer not to talk, that's okay too. You can just put your question in the chat. Next slide. So this is our funding statement from our funders. We are funded by Health Resources and Services Administration of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and we appreciate their support for not only our event today, but also for the work that we do at Mountain States Regional Genetics Network. Next slide. So just a little overview of what we're going to do today. We have a little icebreaker. Don't worry, we won't be putting you on the spot, but just to get our brains warmed up around genetics. We will then be sharing a family story. One of our genetic navigators is here to share their story with you. We have a questions video that we will also share, and then we will turn it over to you all and listen to the questions that you have for us and hopefully be able to provide answers. We do not have all the answers. We are not medical professionals, but we are here to help you navigate genetics. So we will do our very best to answer your questions and provide you with resources to help you answer your questions. Next slide. So our icebreaker today, I will ask if everyone can find the chat at the bottom of your screen. Click that so you can see your chat box. And just type in there, what do you think of when you hear the word genetics? What's the first thing that pops up into your mind? Feel free to type that in the chat so everyone can see it. Someone said their daughter, human genome, answers, biological inheritance from mother and father, DNA. These are all great words. Next slide. Is there a genetic answer to my chronic pain? DNA. This slide is just some of the words that pop into people's minds sometimes when they're thinking about the word genetic. And the next slide will also give you some word clouds of some of the things that people might think of when they hear the word genetic. Genetic therapies, CRISPR technology have been in the news lately. RNA, we've heard a lot about during COVID, DNA, biology. So thank you for sharing. That was just a way to get our minds warmed up around the topic of genetics today. Next slide. So some of you put in the chat that you may know someone very close to you, a very close loved one that has a genetic condition or genetic disorder, and that may have brought you here today. Others of you may have come to just learn more. Maybe you work with families who are impacted by genetic conditions. We are just glad you are all here today, whether you know someone or don't know someone with a genetic condition. These statistics here we got off of the Texas website, and I just want to make a note that the words disorder, condition, disease, diagnosis, and difference may be used interchangeably in the medical field when coupled with the word genetic. And so I don't mean to offend anyone by using certain terminology. I'm quoting these statistics from the Texas website, but 1 in 9 children admitted to the hospital in the United States has a genetic condition or disorder. 1 in 12 adults admitted to the hospital has a genetic disorder, and 1 in 22 people in the United States has a genetic disorder. Unfortunately, 20 to 30% of all infant deaths are oftentimes due to genetic disorders and conditions. Next slide. And this slide shows these numbers a little bit of a different way. This paper was just published by some of the individuals that we work with in the Regional Genetics Network. And this is a prevalence study, meaning how prevalent are genetic conditions among children. And this study took the data from 2016 and 2017 and found that 3.9% of children reported having a genetic condition. And so I have these made graphically here on the left-hand side. Those are 100 children, and about 4 of them colored in there would be the ones that would be impacted by a genetic condition. So as you can see, if you know 100 people, it's very possible that four of those people, if they are all children, may be impacted by genetics. But whether you know someone or not, as we said, we are glad you're here today to learn more about genetics, to hear other people's questions about genetics, and to really have a safe space to be able to ask your questions about genetics. Next slide. So we've been doing genetic pop-ups for about 4 years now, and we always do them around Rare Disease Day. Rare Disease Day was this past Monday. It was February 28th, the rarest day of the year is why it's held on February 28th or 29th in leap year. And these are some of the infographics from Rare Disease Day. 72% of rare diseases are genetic, and 70% of genetic rare diseases start in childhood. It's estimated there are over 6,000 rare diseases impacting more than 300 million people worldwide. Why do we pick Rare Disease Day to have our genetic pop-ups? It's because Mountain States Regional Genetics Network does not represent just one genetic condition. We are not a support group for just a specific condition. We are funded to increase access to individuals in our region for all genetic conditions. And with the numbers you can see here, Rare Disease Day encompasses quite a few of those genetic conditions. Next slide, please. Now I'd like to introduce you to some of our genetic navigators. Next slide. Last year, around this time, we had an application open for genetic navigators, individuals who had navigated genetics with their own family members. These 8 individuals here on the screen were the ones that were selected from our 8 states to go through a training to become a genetic navigator. They have years of experience navigating their own loved one's genetic journey, and now they are helping other families in the Mountain States Regional Genetics Network to navigate genetics in the states they represent. So we have Known from Arizona, Jamie from Colorado, Jennifer from Montana, Hannah from Nevada, Jennifer from New Mexico, Lourdes from Texas, Tristan in Utah, and Melody in Wyoming. And we have some of them on the call today, who I will introduce you to later for our question and answers. But right now, I'd like to share the floor with one of our genetic navigators, Jamie from Colorado, who's going to be sharing with us some about her family's story and navigating genetics. Jamie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I am the mother of 2 children with a rare genetic disorder, about, as far as I know, 40 in the world at the moment. It's TELO2 or Hoover-Fong syndrome. I have a 15-year-old and a 13-year-old. I'm also a PT and a neuromovement practitioner and a number of other certifications and things that I've actually sought out to help my children. So when my children were born, they didn't have the whole exome and whole genome sequencing. They didn't have it until they were older, until they were probably in about elementary school. And I had my pregnancies with them weren't super complicated, but I did have a little bit of complication with my son. For example, they were both born early. I had intrauterine growth retardation, and that's really a broad term, meaning it could be from any number of reasons, but basically my son wasn't growing anymore. There was a lack of blood flow to him, and he was born oxygen deprived as well. So when he was born, I figured he's going to have some delays. There's going to be something. He just wasn't progressing. And then when my daughter was born 2 years later, she was even less. She met her milestones even less. And where we've lived in 5 states, more cities than that. And so where we were, there wasn't a children's hospital. It was 5 hours away. And it was a pretty rural area. And they said, well, you know, they just didn't take me seriously since I was in the medical field. They said, you're overreacting. So many children will just catch up. And they just never did. So I ended up going on vacation with my husband for our 10th anniversary, and I had my mother and aunt watch the kids. And I wrote a letter in medical jargon, medical shorthand. And so my mother couldn't read the note, but the doctor actually had to sit down and look at the note and read it himself. And he's like, maybe we can look into this a little bit. And they, because up until that point, my son was 2.5 and my daughter was about 9 months. And my daughter wasn't even holding her head up at that point. And he just, and he had ignored every request I had for seeking early intervention and services and looking into it. And so he said, well, let's do an imaging study. And that didn't really turn up with anything. So at that point I said, well, they're not letting me into the system in Arkansas, which is where they were born. So I went to another state where I'm actually from on the East Coast, and went through Johns Hopkins and had them seen there. So we flew out and had a whole team, neurologists, geneticists, developmental peds, all look at the children. They said something is going on here. So at the time they did a SNP array, and they didn't find anything. But of course they were just looking at one little thing, and they said, you know, if we find anything, it's going to be like finding a needle in the haystack at this point. We recommend when the whole exome, whole genome sequencing comes out, you get that done for your kids. So we started to get services because we had been seen through a major center. And I had a recommendation from them, and I had somebody for me that was a colleague of mine write a recommendation to my pediatrician to have my kids start to receive services. Then, so we've moved around, moved to another state. Once the whole exome, whole genome sequencing came around, we had blood drawn for that. That took about a year and a half to get results for at the time. And nothing of consequence came out of it. A whole bunch of things that were just from one parent that you needed 2 genes for, a lot of variants of unknown significance came up, but nothing that would have caused a disease to be present in them that matched. So a couple of years down the road, during this time, we kept having some things come up, different healthcare issues, and they also have autism, and everybody kept saying, oh, it's just autism. And I said, no, because I personally dug and was like, well, there's a reason for their lack of focus, their anxiety, their eating issues. And so I found, you know, they do actually have some stuff going on GI wise. They have cortical visual impairment. So, you know, you can have behaviors from autism aren't always from, you know, from just the diagnosis of autism. That can be some other underlying health issues that present, that look like autism, that cause the child to have those behaviors. So they also had some eye things, and so they reran the data from the whole exome sequencing, and nothing. So we moved states again because my husband's job, and the geneticist said, I really think there's something going on here because you have 2 kids with a multiple organ system involvement, multiple things going on. Let's redraw the blood and send it through a different lab. So this was about 4 or 5 years ago now. They redrew the blood, sent it to a different lab, and lo and behold, we found something. And it came up as variants of unknown significance. However, my geneticist dug and found that there was one paper with 6 kids that had the same thing. And so and now there's 40 in the world. And so it came out of, our diagnosis came out of variants of unknown significance. And we have a group online, and so we all communicate. However, since it's so rare, as it's on Facebook, our group is on Facebook, each person that joins, they're like, we thought we were like the only ones besides that first paper. So we're trying to spread the word, because if you're rare, it's really hard to get that. We're finding it's hard to get that word out there that there's more of us. It's not just one person with that condition. So so that's our story. It's our journey. It's been a long while. My kids didn't get diagnosed until they were about 11 and 9 years old. And during that time, I just sought other ways to help them and to help them thrive. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Jamie, for sharing your story and your journey that crossed multiple states and took you finally to Colorado, where you are now. Thank you for your insights. With that, I'm going to now share a video that features some of our other genetic navigators, as well as Jamie, sharing some questions that they had when they first started navigating their journey with their own loved ones. So give me just a moment to do that. I will make a note for those of you on the Spanish channel. You may want to mute your original audio because the video will play at 100% from what I'm told at volume. So you may want to mute the original so that you will be able to hear the interpretation. Hello, and thank you for a few short minutes of your time. Let me tell you a little bit about the Mountain States Regional Genetics Network. Who is Mountain States Regional Genetics Network, or MSRGN for short, you might ask? MSRGN is a regional network consisting of 8 states: Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, and we are funded federally by HRSA that funds the 7 regional genetics networks, which includes MSRGN, along with the Family Center and the National Coordinating Center. The mission of the regional genetics networks is to increase access to genetic services for individuals and their families, including those who are underserved in our region. In 2021, Mountain States Regional Genetics Network selected 8 individuals who had navigated the genetic journey for their own loved ones in their own state. These individuals became our genetic navigators and are now available to help families navigate genetics. Genetic navigators offer resources, guidance, and navigation to others from a perspective of someone who has been there and done that and has been on a genetics path and journey for their own loved ones. Sometimes we all just need a helping hand. The ultimate goal of the program is navigating to hope for families who may be filled with questions, who may be looking for resources, or who may be experiencing barriers to accessing genetic services in their state. Anyone who has ever been on a genetics journey has been filled with questions. Today, we will be sharing questions that our own genetic navigators had when they first started navigating for their own families.
I think the biggest question I had when we first started thinking about what we needed from the genetics world was how to get that genetics referral. My son had Down syndrome diagnosis at birth, and so the idea that we would need to revisit genetics was hard for some of the specialists to wrap their brains around, but because he was declining rapidly and no one could come up with a solution, trying to navigate that route to getting the actual referral was more difficult than I had anticipated. So that advocacy piece of being able to say, this is why I want genetics for my son and why I think it will be helpful. I think those are the questions that if I had been more prepared to answer, maybe I would have been able to get the referral a little easier.
So I didn't have a big question starting out the genetics journey with my family. Having worked in healthcare and worked with kids with many of the known genetic disorders. So I was fairly confident that my children didn't have one of the known disorders. And I was skeptical that we would even find anything, since whole exome and whole genome sequencing weren't available at the time. My main concern was getting some sort of diagnosis or report that would allow me to get services for my children, insurance coverage, and to find direction in how to help them.
This question I have all throughout the process, but a part of the process that stands out to me is when we had just started our genetic testing journey, and I started conversing with other rare families and went to an international or a national conference on rare disease. And I started to learn that not all hospitals were the same, not all doctors were the same. And so that became my question, is like, how do I know what's really available to my child for genetic testing? Because I'm realizing then that it depends on the doctor and what they want to offer, and of course insurance. And so I had to do some research. I still don't think I could completely answer that question.
I think my biggest question was, what now? Which feels very broad, but with our condition, there was so many things to plan and do. We went from, just having some very general therapeutic services to needing so many specialists, to needing to add insurances, to figuring out access to doctors who even knew what his condition was. And it felt very overwhelming. We had not, thought about genetics. We weren't looking for a genetic diagnosis. So I didn't think genetics until the day that we got our diagnosis for our son when he was 1. So you don't just get hit with, your kid has this condition. You get hit with, and now we've got to do this, and we've got to apply for this insurance, and we've got to put all these things in place. And so that first couple of months was just so overwhelming. And then treatment too, treatment was very overwhelming with all of the things that we suddenly knew that he needed, and he needed it now.
I think the biggest question I had was, my daughter was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis. So they use what's called a sweat test. It's sort of the standard test for diagnosing CF. And it's just, they collect sweat and they measure how much chloride. And then infants, young children who have really high levels, that's a positive for probably having CF. And then my daughter had genetic testing. So I'll say, going into genetic testing, I was just so relieved to have a diagnosis, because she was a really sick little baby. I was just so relieved. And when they did the genetic testing and then came back and told me these letters and numbers, Delta F508, I wanted to know, what does that mutation, how does that impact her? Because cystic fibrosis, at that time, they knew there were hundreds of different genetic mutations that cause CF. Now they know there's at least 2,000. And I wanted to know, so this mutation correlates with what? Like genotype, phenotype. This mutation correlates to what severity of disease? So I had questions about that. And then I had questions, I think, like most moms, what can I do? What can I do to keep her healthy? What can I do to make sure she lives as long as she can and has the best quality of life? Those were my biggest questions.
I appreciate the opportunity to think about this question. It took 12 years for us to diagnose my daughter, and the whole time we were working with genetics. So the biggest question I started to have was, what happens, or how do we proceed when you have a person who you think has a genetic diagnosis, but every year and every test you do comes back with no answer? And for us, that was to do the whole exome sequencing.
Thank you for your time today in listening to our video. If you would like to connect with the Genetic Navigator for your state, please go to the Mountain States website, www.mountainstatesgenetics.org/GN. There you will find our 8 genetic navigators and their email address, and you can reach out to them and contact them that way. In addition, if you have further questions about Mountain States or would like to connect with our network, please reach out to us on the Contact tab at our website. We'd also like to thank our funders, HRSA, for their support of our program. Thank you everyone for staying tuned in for our video there. We are going to take a momentary pause and ask you to check the chat because we have now time for a gift card drawing that we'd like to ask if you would like to be entered into a gift card drawing as a thank you for being here today. To please click either the English or the Spanish link there and enter your information in there. This is not required. You don't have to take part in that. It's just for those who would like to, and we sincerely appreciate having you being here with us today. With that, Cody, could you share the slides again? Thanks. Next slide. Next slide. So hopefully you've seen those gift card links in the chat, and we'll give you just a moment to click those and fill those out. The information that we are collecting there is just for our grant funder purposes. And so that information will not be shared with anybody. We keep it in-house, but in order to be able to send those gift cards out, we do need to collect that information for those who would like to be part of the gift card drawing. We will be notifying the gift card winners by email. And so take a look for that. And next slide, please. And with that, we are coming to our halfway point in our time together today, and it is time for your questions. The part you've probably all been waiting for. So just as a reminder, we would ask that you would either type your questions in the chat or raise your hand and wait to be called on, and then unmute your line once you're called on to ask your question in person. Next slide. Just as a reminder, if you're new to raising your hand, this is where you can find it down on that bar at the bottom of your Zoom. You can look for reactions with the little smiley face, click that, and then click raise hand. But again, if you prefer not to speak out loud, that's okay. You can put your questions in the chat. And I am excited to have these genetic navigators joining us today. I think I saw one other joining us too, Lourdes from Texas. So I think we have the top 2 rows possibly with us here. But we have Noan from Arizona, Jamie from Colorado, whose story you heard earlier, Hannah from Nevada, Jennifer from New Mexico, and Lourdes from Texas. So I will ask if we can stop sharing and then come back to where we can see everybody. And I see some hands raised. So I will